The next little bit, this is our diagnosis and classification discussion, which is basically how do we decide if you have a particular disorder or not? And I've mentioned having sort of standardized diagnostic criteria, rules, sort of things that you need to meet in order to qualify for certain disorders. That's what we're going to get to discuss. This slide here is more meant to be an example showing the prevalence of some of our different psychological disorders. I think this is in Canada, which is why I was so excited to include it, but we're not going to dwell on this too much here. I'll just point out things like mood disorders. We're saying 10% of Canadians, well, more than 10%, will be diagnosed with a mood disorder at some point in their life. If we look at, what else do we have? Major depressive disorder would be about 10% also. So you can see some of these are fairly common across the lifetime. In a 1-year period, they tend to be much smaller, obviously. We're looking at shorter time spans, but I like seeing how common some of these disorders are, because especially if you don't talk about them or if you yourself don't know anyone with any of these diagnoses, you tend to underestimate how common they are. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the statistics as we get into specific disorders eventually. Now, as always, when we're talking about diagnostic considerations and our standardized ways of determining particular scores, in this case, we're having scores of diagnosis or no diagnosis, or disorder versus no disorder, but we've talked about these same terms when we were looking at our personality tests, when we were looking at our intelligence tests. So anytime we have some kind of standardized measure that we're using to make a determination, we want to consider both the reliability of the measures that we're using. Basically, we want consistency. So reliability and consistency are the two associations here. But if you have a reliable measure, then we're saying that we are going to have consistent use of that measure. And the way that we're describing it here is we can have many different clinicians or diagnosticians, if they're using the exact same standard, should be giving us similar scores for the same individual. Basically, if there is one person who has depression, regardless of which therapist, which diagnostician they see, they should always walk away with that same agreement that, yes, you have depression. That isn't always the case, but that's the goal here. You could also say things like reliability would say that if we tested the same person multiple times over time, if it's something that shouldn't be changing, then we should expect that diagnosis to stay the same across time too. So reliability is looking at consistency in a bunch of dimensions. Validity, in contrast, is looking a lot more about the fact that does our measure, is our standardized test actually capturing the concept that we're trying to capture? So are our questions, our criteria that relate to depression actually related to depression? So here we're saying that we want our diagnostic categories to accurately capture the essential features of our disorders. This is focusing not only on do our things that we're measuring relate to our disorder of interest, but also do we have enough of them to fully capture the depth of that particular disorder. So we want them to relate. It should be a valid measure in terms of connecting to that abstract concept, and it should do a good job of getting the entirety of the concepts related to it. So we want all aspects of depression captured, and we want to make sure that each of those aspects directly relates to some component that makes up sort of depression as a disorder as a whole. And if you go into, again, methodology courses, you can talk about a bunch of different types of validity. So using these definitions are actually describing different subtypes of validity. But for us, we're just caring about the fact that it is an accurate measure, something that directly relates and captures completely our concept of interest. It's a good way of summarizing them all. So accuracy and sort of connecting to a concept for validity. Reliability is consistency across scenarios. Hopefully you would know to be able to tell the difference between the two. All right, and then if we're saying what are our standards, you've probably heard of this before, but the DSM-5 is our current standard, at least in North America. So this is our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition. Technically, they have already done a revision to this. So it is the DSM-5 TR. And I don't know what the TR stands for. It's probably in my notes somewhere, but I don't want to scroll through. This is one of those slides where my notes are just a chunk from Wikipedia. But this is our new standard. This is something that was updated back in 2013. This is something that is constantly revised. And even once we've had our major revision to the 5th edition, moving from 4th to 5th, they've still had small updates, hence the TR that we've added on, showing that there has been a pretty major overhaul, but not enough to get into a 6th edition. And from how often they've been doing these revisions, we're probably going to see another one in the next few years, because as we learn more about different psychological disorders, we're constantly making changes and adjustments, whether it's the types of questions we ask, the criteria that are required, or even how we group different disorders under larger categories. That shifts dramatically over time. So this particular manual started back in the 1950s. It was run by the American Psychiatric Association, so they're still in charge of this. And as we move through it, there's actually three main sections. The first is basically the history of what has changed and maybe a little bit of why it's changed over time. This is kind of important, especially if we're looking at, say, somebody who received a diagnosis under an earlier edition of a particular manual. So if you went and received a diagnosis under the DSM-4, well, in the DSM-5, some of those original diagnoses actually don't exist any longer. There are certain categories that were removed or replaced or put under different labels. There's all sorts of changes. So it's kind of interesting if you go and look at what those main changes were, there are lots of them. We'll focus on a couple of big ones, but there's many, many more. Then we get into section 2, where we have our different criteria for our main diagnostic categories and the disorders that fall within those. So this is when we actually get our list of disorders and the symptoms associated. And then section 3 is when we've said, all right, so we know the disorders and the symptoms. Here's the measures that we can use to actually assess whether you meet certain criteria. And it also does a really good job because it lists the limitations. So what are our criteria for disorders that need further research? If you read into it and look at some of the history, certain disorders, their only diagnostic criteria might come from, say, a single lab that researches this particular disorder. Whereas others that are more widely studied, their standardized criteria might have come from decades of work averaged across many, many experiments and many, many labs, and it's something that's more widely agreed upon. And that variation in how much we actually trust our standardized assessment measures can vary dramatically between disorders. So some are very trusted, others not so much. And recently we've had more of a focus on sociocultural considerations, which is very important, and will continue moving forward. So we have this sort of overview of our DSM-5 diagnostic categories or classes. And there are 22 different major categories. And this, as I've said before, is something that changes. So with each of our updated versions, each of our different editions, we'll actually find that some of these categories have been added, some of them have been removed, some of them have been split or joined together. There's all sorts of movement. And this actually starts causing problems when it comes to diagnostic labeling, because if somebody was diagnosed with, say, the DSM-4, there are certain diagnoses that no longer exist. So there are a couple that were removed for, say, harmful connotations. So Asperger's syndrome was one that was taken out and folded into autism spectrum disorder. You also have things like in even earlier editions, being homosexual was actually categorized as one of the DSM, I think it was 3 maybe, though don't quote me on the numbers. It was one of the diagnoses. So there are all sorts of different ways that this changes, and it's changing sort of as our views in society change, but also as our understanding of different disorders change. And I've used the example a couple of times of the fact that PTSD used to be considered just an anxiety disorder. However, because there are so many other facets to it, including a whole bunch of things that relate to, say, depression, but as well as some things that are like flashbacks and stuff that isn't quite just anxiety exclusive, it's now in its own category. So there's all sorts of interesting things like that. And it's one of the reasons why we stress that it's good that the DSM-5 itself actually has a whole section explaining some of those changes and why they've happened. Now, when it comes to some of our criticisms, I've already been heavily introducing some of these. Things like the categories change consistently, but we can also complain about the fact that it is still category based. We are putting sort of boxes around different individuals. So we are creating these diagnostic labels where we're looking at sort of disorder versus no disorder. Whereas once we're within our different disorder labels, we actually acknowledge that there is a spectrum where you can have a whole bunch of different dimensionalities to any one of these diagnostic categories. And even when we look at disorder versus no disorder, that's actually evaluated again on a continuum with a particular cutoff. And as much as we can say, well, it's kind of minimalistic to say yes or no in terms of our questions, but it's actually one of the only ways that we can really quantify this. And so the system is set up in that way to keep categories. So as much as we'll complain about it, it's actually consistent across all of our diagnostic categories just due to the nature of diagnosing. We also have, of course, issues with validity. And we've mentioned before our validity when we also talked reliability. But validity is, are we actually testing what it is that we think we're testing? So if we're asking questions for a diagnostics test, are we actually capturing sort of different levels of that disorder? Well, in fact, what we often see is that we're really describing symptoms and asking questions about the symptoms rather than the disorder itself, which may be fine in some cases, but we'll also start acknowledging that a lot of different disorders, and even across many categories, actually have shared and similar symptoms. Again, that's why when we look at, say, PTSD, it will also flag a lot of the symptoms for both depression and anxiety because the symptoms are all the same, or at least similar in certain areas. So that's our issue with validity. I've also mentioned before that some of these areas have been widely studied. So when we talk schizophrenia, that is something that has been studied extensively since I think the 60s. And so we have a lot of information on it. We have a lot of very supported diagnostic criteria. We have standardized tests and things that have been used for decades at this point. But some of the other disorders, especially ones that are, say, newer additions in more recent versions of the DSM-5, we end up with very little sort of standardized testing. And so sometimes those criteria end up being based on not even research itself, but sometimes people sitting and talking about what would make a good checklist to see if somebody has a disorder or not. And in that case, you kind of have these very different levels of how much you trust our diagnostic process based on which disorder it is we're looking at. And even within the ones that are research based, they are all very different from one another. So if you went for an assessment for multiple disorders, the process of having those criteria checked, the questions they ask, or even the style of interviews can be very, very different depending on which disorder it is you're looking at. So that inconsistency is fairly problematic if you're trying to make comparisons. We also, again, find high comorbidity between diagnoses because oftentimes our disorders are sharing symptoms. So we'll actually find that if you have sort of one diagnosis, you are significantly more likely to have a second, oftentimes similarly associated diagnosis. So we'll talk about a bunch of these, but even looking at things like anxiety and depression, the two tend to co-occur more often than not. So in those cases, if you are sort of getting one label, there's usually that overlap with another at the same time. And having multiple diagnoses can end up masking or hiding or exacerbating certain symptoms. So that just adds that extra complexity. So lots of criticisms here, but again, we're going to find that these are criticisms that hold for pretty much any of our categorization approaches. And of course, we do have alternatives. And this is another one of those, let's add complexity so it's even harder to compare between countries. But you'll sometimes see something called the IDC-10, which is the International Classification of Disease and Health-Related Problems. But this one's been around for quite a while. It's sponsored by the WHO and is fairly commonly used in Europe. So this is the European standard for the most part. though we do actually see it fairly commonly in Canada as well. Canada does that, let's be partially European, let's be partially North American, and mix the two. So you'll occasionally see either the DSM-5 or this IDC-10, depending on where you are and what training you have, which makes it, again, complicated. You will also sometimes see the RDOC, which is the Research Domain Criteria Project, and this is sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health, and it's used sporadically in the US. So sometimes you will see other standards, and these are not the only ones. These are just the most common and relevant ones for us, but we're going to be sticking with the DSM-5 because that is across the board the North American standard for the most part. So we'll just focus on that one. All right, more potential issues with diagnostic labels. When we start looking at labeling things, we've focused before on the fact that with humans, we like to simplify. We like to look at things in terms of categories, especially if we don't have a whole lot of useful information. And coming out of our social psychology section, where we were talking about the fact that when we have no other reliable information, stereotypes are our fallback. We can, of course, start understanding why it might be problematic to assign certain labels, certain diagnostic labels to individuals. And this can be either for the individual themselves, because once you are told that you have a particular diagnostic label, you've been diagnosed with anxiety. Well, you have a certain mental image of what it means to be a person with anxiety. And sometimes you'll actually find that people end up almost leaning into the stereotypes for their specific diagnosis. So it might be something like, well, now that they've been diagnosed, they're a little bit more comfortable not hiding it. But sometimes it's also that they feel like they should almost personify what that disorder means to them. So you can actually find that these individuals will start sort of fitting that stereotype of the disorder, either intentionally or unintentionally, just based on internalized assumptions. We can also find that others may treat us differently based on that diagnostic label. This is one of the reasons why, especially in, say, workplaces, they make it so that you can't be forced to disclose any kind of diagnosis because it can affect how people interact with you. So it can be a source of discrimination. People might treat you differently because of it. You can also have things like people make assumptions, and we talked about those self-fulfilling prophecies, where if you approach someone expecting certain behaviors and you act towards them in a way that's anticipating that, you can actually create that behavior through that process. So again, tying together a bunch of different concepts here. So we're seeing that this label can become something where we create stereotypes, we create assumptions of how people should act or how we ourselves should act, and it can change some of our behaviors on both sides. We also, of course, have legal consequences. Things like once you have a particular diagnostic label, you might lose certain rights and responsibilities and things like that, certain freedoms. So there are some labels where maybe you get a psychiatric hold. Maybe they've deemed that because you have a certain disorder that you're now not safe in the public. And especially if you're in a situation where maybe it was a misdiagnosis, you might take very, very long periods of time to try and write that because you yourself can't act on your own behalf. You can also start finding things like, can they detain you indefinitely? Is this something that might have like legal ramifications in terms of criminal liability and stuff like that? So yeah, very, very interesting to consider. And of course, there's a lot of history along with a lot of that. And I find especially learning about Albertan history, because I'm not from here, I'm much more familiar with sort of Eastern stuff. The history here is very interesting for stuff like that, and interesting in a not great way. But in most places, that's kind of what you find when you dig a little deeper. We also have sort of legal considerations with competency and insanity in terms of pleas. That's a lot more of an Americanized view. They have different terms in Canada, but it's not usually something we see on, say, the media, because it's all very American focused. But we can have things like competency of somebody, are they able to stand and defend themselves or talk on their own behalf in a court hearing? And sometimes maybe people aren't capable of that. You can also have insanity, which is trying to get at the state of mind at the time a crime was committed. So I think that's another one of those terms. They are slowly looking at changing. But again, sort of from media, those are the two that you often see talked about. Um, all right, what else do we have? Diagnoses across cultures. I've already said now that we have different standards in different parts of the world. So having different diagnostic manuals, of course, means that our diagnosis process is going to differ in different places. So this means that somebody being diagnosed with, say, schizophrenia in North America, it may or may not qualify for that diagnosis in another place. And because our different label categories are changing, I'm sure that there are some that don't line up across our different diagnostic methods. So in those cases, you'd have to sort of understand where it is that you're drawing information from. So when this comes to things like looking at the literature and trying to make determinations of, say, prevalence of a particular disorder, you then also have to keep in mind things like where in the world is this data coming from and what are the standards for diagnosis there. You also have to consider things like cultural views on mental illness and psychological disorders, where things like, say, there's social pressures where it's not acceptable to show certain types of symptoms, people might fail to seek out diagnoses. This is something that's been sort of very forefront in society, at least in North America, trying to push people to say, hey, it's okay to reach out and get help. And this is often something where newer generations raised with that mentality are a lot more comfortable seeking help. And that leads to sort of higher and higher rates of diagnoses as the years have gone on, which leads to the debate of are these things actually increasing or is it one of those biases in terms of seeking treatment or not? Because I know that in some of the older generations, they really had that sort of suck it up attitude where, it's not really a big problem. It's just you need to try harder. So in those cases, you have lots of biases in the numbers you look at as well. Now, if I stick with what's actually on the slide, because as I'm sure you can tell, this is one of those topics you can really dig into sort of the behind the scenes stuff. But we do have some things that are called culture bound disorders. And these are going to be disorders that are specific to particular cultures. Kind of makes sense from the name. But in these cases, these are often things that are associated with, say, local mythology or local ideals, where they have certain things that are really, really important or really, really scary to a particular group, and there are disorders around that. There's a bunch of really neat ones. Again, I've borrowed this from another source, but there are a couple of different ones from different places around the world if you wanted to read up on those. We don't have tons of time for it, but I figured I'd include it because some of them are very, very interesting. And again, it's mainly because certain cultures or in very specific communities, you have certain fears that tend to be really, really prevalent and can have associated, oftentimes anxiety related disorders that go along with it. And then at the top here, because I'm jumping around tons, the idea of culture universality is the fact that we sometimes end up finding very specific disorders that show up almost consistently and almost universally across different cultures around the world. Schizophrenia, yet again, is one of the examples of that, where we find that regardless of the country that you're looking at, the rates tend to be very, very similar. Even with different diagnostic criteria, the label seems to be consistently applied, and the background rates tend to be fairly consistent, which gives us a little bit of an idea that there's probably a strong genetic component here, which we know from the research is actually the case. But that explains why it is found pretty much everywhere. We do sometimes find that names and treatments and sort of how they get that diagnosis can differ. But oftentimes, once you sort of dig into, well, what is it that this is describing, you'll find a lot of parallels around the world. And that's one of those reasons why we can make some pretty good arguments that there are genetic components or biological components to a lot of these.